If you've ever wondered how content moderation works in virtual worlds, you're in the right place. In this next session, legal expert and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, Brittan Heller, will help us gain insight into the unique ways moderation works in 3D, how this impacts the privacy and safety rights of gamers, and what developers need to know to be successful. So please give a warm welcome to Brittan.
Thank you for having me here today. Let's start with a story. Who here has heard of Lego Universe? Okay. Lego Universe was a highly anticipated, massive multiplayer online game like Roblox or Minecraft. That ended up being shuttered. The original idea for the experience looked great. And the company wanted to give users the opportunity to use Lego components to build their own worlds. Given how utterly trusted the Lego brand was by parents, the company was also committed to robust content moderation. But if you study content moderation like I do, you're familiar with a kind of spicy term called time to penis. And what I mean by time to penis is what is the actual interval it takes between a user entering a world and people starting to draw phalluses in the environment. So what was the time to penis for this world? Well, often it's not very long. All puns intended. Lego needed to, amongst other things, prevent users from publishing environments with adult content in it. And it intended to whitelist content, so to review things beforehand before putting it into the world. Ultimately, they found that this was not going to be possible. There was no way to create an automated, scalable, economical way to prevent users from creating adult content in their creations. It became a wide-scale problem and was ultimately what sank the project. Now, this is not an unusual story. Most companies find that their expectations about governing and moderating user behavior in spatial computing are turned on their head. My name is Brittan Heller. I like to describe myself as the lawyer of the Black Mirror. I teach at Stanford. I'm a visiting fellow at the Virtual Human Interaction Lab, and I look at how we are going to prepare for a post-cell phone future. Today, I want to talk to you about how content moderation works and how it's different when we move from a flat screen to an XR environment. There are 3 takeaways that I think you should take away from this talk today. First, immersive media is different. It is different than social media, and this is because it has a different impact on our bodies and on our minds. 2, for all of the engineering nerds in the room, the different tech stacks mean that there are different layers of enforcement for content moderation in XR. And for all the rest of us, number 3, AI will not save us here. So number 1, this is not social media, this is immersive media. And the difference is very, very important. It is a mistake to treat immersive technologies like new forms of pre-existing social media. And this is because XR environments have different psychological and neurological impacts on their users. It is not like socializing in video gamed worlds. It is not like interacting on social media. When you study immersive worlds, there are 3 characteristics that we look to determine how immersive an environment is. I like to use the acronym PI to remember them all. First is presence. Presence has been studied in communications departments for decades. and it's formally known as the illusion of non-mediation. In normal speak, this means when XR is done right, you don't see the gadgets. There's no helmet. It's you and the magic and the music and the experience. In other words, XR feels real, where social media does not feel real. Jeremy Bailenson is the founding scholar and the director of the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab, where I'm a visiting scholar. He likes to say that we should think of VR not as a media experience, but closer to an actual experience. And the way that we do this at the lab when we take people on a tour is the first thing we do is we make them walk a plank over a pit. Before we talk to you about how VR can be a tool for empathy and identification with another person, before we talk to you about its potential for education, we want to really show you how real it feels. So you're going to walk the plank. And this is also a good setup to help demonstrate one of the long historical successes of VR, which is treating phobias like fear of heights. So after presence, we look to immersion. And this is how users feel like they are really in an alternative environment. Not just that it feels real, but for the grown-up theater nerds like me, how we set the scene. A virtual opera performance must have all the trappings of watching a performance in a physical theater. You have to have different views from different seats. You have to have movement flows through the aisles. You have to think about spatially oriented sound that comes from appropriately different locations depending on the origin of the sound. You have to have low light when the performance starts. These are the ways that an XR experience also has to work. You have to include sensory input to stimulate the user, and that includes light, sound, even sense and tactile stimuli. Tactile. 3 is embodiment, and this is when you feel like the form of your avatar or physical body is your actual body. A researcher called Mel Slater in the 1990s demonstrated this by taking something called the rubber hand illusion. And that's going to be the picture, right? The rubber hand illusion. Researchers placed a toy hand in a VR environment and went Looney Tunes on it. They hit it with a mallet, stabbed it with a knife. They really abused this rubber hand. And to the user who looked through VR and saw that rubber hand where their hand should be, and it receiving all of this abuse, people reacted like it was their own hand. Their brain told them that this was a bodily experience. So embodiment is very powerful. It can be beneficial, having medical applications. If you didn't abuse the rubber hand, it could actually be used to help treat phantom limb pain, if your brain perceives it as your actual limb. It can be used in educational contexts designed to engender empathy, but it can also place users at risk. When you think about the violence and harassment that many users have reported in XR environments. So if this all feels so real when presence, immersion, and embodiment work together, what about our minds? What happens in an XR experience is processed via your hippocampus. It's the same way that you are sitting here listening to me talk now and creating a memory of the experience. And if you think about it that way, Tom Furness, one of the original creators of head-mounted devices, says that experiences in VR are drawn on the brain in permanent ink. It is more like you entering into my living room and screaming in my face than me reading harsh words on a Twitter feed. Because of how XR impacts our bodies and our minds, it is a mistake to simply cut and paste pre-existing content moderation terms of service from flat screen to XR environments. You can't presume the same rules will operate the same way in a 3D environment. Second, there are different stack layers and moderation vectors in spatial computing. I'm going to break that down so it sounds a little more digestible, but content moderation on the traditional internet and social media focuses on two components: user conduct and user content. For example, somebody might analyze a user's posted content on social media to determine if it meets community standards about hate speech, self-harm, pornography. Separately, a content moderation system will determine if a user is harassing others through constant messaging or sending out spam or abusing a platform by sending out false reports. Content and conduct. XR content moderation is different because it has to consider both of these dimensions, but it also needs to consider the environment in which the content and the conduct occur. This is the key difference. If you're going to create a 3D world, you have to moderate in 3 dimensions, especially when user-generated content can be the objects in the world and the fundamental architecture of the world itself. This means you can't create a one-size-fits-all code of conduct if you want your rules to be enforceable. In XR, we have a content layer, like individual user experiences. A content layer, like individual user experiences. A conduct layer, which hosts user-to-user interactions and interactivity between the user and their world. And an environmental layer, the architecture of the worlds along with the digital objects that users build to populate these places. Additionally, VR, AR, and mixed reality have different form factors that lead the user to experience different risks than they would in a flat screen social media environment. For example, a user can design a strip club and seek to embed it in a VR space aimed primarily for children. It's where it goes, not what it is. A user could impede a virtual pool game by buying somebody else a drink and placing it on the pool table. A normal reaction, a normal game-playing dynamic, you may think, but if it's done en masse, it can actually impede gameplay, so it functions like spam. A user could also create overlays of Nazi symbols onto real buildings in AR. And the location and type of building would determine the level of risk to the user and to bystanders, even though the symbols themselves are generally inappropriate outside of historical contexts. But what if you wanted to use it in an educational program? It's the way your interface works, combined with your content, that define the level of risk that your users are going to face. Grappling with these environmental dimensions has already had substantial impacts for companies. We talked about the Lego example. I almost started this talk saying that I don't need to use a story, because if you go into XR with an identity and an appearance like mine, you know very quickly that harassment is a problem. And most people know this, and many, many people have experienced it. It's reminiscent of a piece that came out in 2005 called A Rape in Cyberspace that talked about a harassment that occurred in an MMO and how the users themselves had to grapple with what you do when something happens to disrupt the culture of your virtual world, but you don't have a set of rules and a governance system to deal with it. And this is very similar to what a lot of virtual world creators are seeing now and what a lot of users are experiencing. 3, platforms are having these problems addressing trust and safety in XR, but it's not due to a lack of will from the companies. It is due primarily to technical constraints. Why didn't Lego just build a filter to take out adult content? Well, you have to look at the way that content moderation works. It's built off of social media models, and the way this functions is through automated filters in an ex-ante fashion. Content is screened using classifiers often before it will hit a user's feed when you're looking at social media. Algorithms are applied to automatically categorize data into one or more categories using classifiers. For example, Facebook will proactively screen and catch 97% of hate speech before it ever hits their feeds. This is because they have a data set of billions and billions of posts, and AI is a fancy form of pattern recognition. They have the data set and the ability to automate it and scale it for billions of pieces of content and billions of users. When you get to the XR context, there are no classifiers. Classifiers are problematic. There are not easy, affordable, scalable ways at this time to create this pattern recognition filter for governing 3D environments. It's behavioral, it's not text. Data sets for spatial computing-based media would be needed to train the algorithms. And right now, we don't have that massive content. If that massive content exists, it's proprietary. If it's proprietary, it's not available to open source developers. Currently, the state of content moderation in XR is this. Either A, it's just not done. B, it relies on user flagging when it is done. Or C, it runs via runarounds like voice to text and then running that through the back end of pre-existing social media systems. None of these is great. Some platforms are trying to develop technological means for this, like attempting to translate audio to text. And then they take that data set, which matches the classifiers they have, run it through the back end, and see what comes out. There have not been really promising reliability metrics coming out of this. I think this is because it is a behavioral transaction that is being flattened, run through, and stripped of almost all context. The tactic is also highly resource intensive for being a partial solution, and it's not able to address real-time moderation needs. Reporting a violation in a social platform like Horizon Worlds will give 1 to 2 minutes of social content back to the platform. That's not a lot. It is very difficult, if you've seen any of these recordings, or if you've seen any of the media reportings about what's happening when people are being abusive, it is very hard to tell who said what to whom, who did what to whom, and what is actually going on, especially with 1 to 2 minutes divorced from the entire interaction. Giving more information seems like the solution, but that's also potentially problematic when you consider that you must balance this with user privacy and data storage and retention limitations for head-mounted devices. Furthermore, reporting is done differently on different platforms. And I've written about this because to me, this seems almost nonsensical and a really interesting way that we as an industry could improve. If something were to happen to me right now, and you were to call 911, we would know what would happen. The paramedics, the police would come. Imagine if every city we went to, 911 was a different number with a different physical form factor that we had to use to contact the authorities. If we had to show up in person, or we had to call, or we had to send a fax, or we had to send an email, nobody would use it because it wasn't standardized. There's no standardized way to ask for help in virtual worlds. Other newer moderation tools claim to use cues like volume or proximity or emotional recognition to anticipate when an altercation is occurring. And this focuses on limited behavioral cues, so it's not trained on specific communities and cultures. And in that way, the moderation solution it provides is going to be partial at best. Generative AI looks like a promising tool to help, but not in the way you think. The best application that has been seen so far that has the nuance required for content moderation is actually giving it as a tool to existing moderators to help them deal with the best and the worst of humanity that crosses their desk every day, to replicate their discretion, but not to help parse and filter the content, conduct, and environmental cues that you would need to process. Realistically, AI content moderation solutions for XR are several years away from being sophisticated enough, having enough data, and having adequate training to work in these environments. So until this changes, companies are going to struggle to automate content moderation for spatial computing like they do for social media. The best practices would be to see companies take dual-tiered content moderation systems like you see in pre-existing gaming worlds. But overall, even with this solution, technical limitations have resulted in the shifting of the burden of moderation from platforms to volunteer guides or community moderators, or to users reporting violations of community standards after they've already been abused. My time has run out, so I think that in conclusion, we really must look at terms of service when we are translating them from flat screen to interactive environments. What was the benefit that they were intending to promote? What's the harm they're intended to prevent or mitigate? And what's the underlying philosophy of the enforcement regime? We have to look not just at the rules, but at the enforcement mechanisms designed to enforce these rules. Do they monitor or track content? Do they deter or reinforce behavior? Is this accomplished by adding friction to operations? Finally, we have to understand when we go into XR, it is different for our bodies and different for our minds. This understanding is vital for the immersive context so that the next generation of computing efforts proceeds more mindfully than our first efforts. And so we can avoid making the same mistakes twice. Thank you very much.